This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
And I'm Julie Grant. When he first ran for president, Donald Trump was called the chaos candidate. And to the bitter end, that's been borne out after a violent mob of his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
But another kind of radical change has happened over the last 4 years, often out of the headlines. Today, we'll look at the effects of Trump's 4 years in the White House on the environment.
Well, I'm an environmentalist. I've won many awards for the environment and from the environment and what I've done to enhance the environment.
He did every single thing that we put on the worst-case scenario list. Now, he hasn't accomplished all those things, but he certainly embarked on an effort to unravel every aspect of the Obama administration's climate action agenda.
And I think I know more about the environment than most people. And I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills.
The health of many Americans are dependent on sound science. Sound science is not leading the decisions made by this nation.
The environment's very important to me. Somebody wrote a book that I'm an environmentalist, it actually called. I have it in the other office. I'll bring it to my next news conference, perhaps. But no, I'm a big believer in that word, the environment.
The president told folks what he was going to do. He told you the kinds of people that he wanted to surround himself with, and people still gave their vote. I had hoped that I was incorrect, but unfortunately, it's been much more damaging than I had ever thought.
When Trump came into office, he promised to prioritize corporations, businesses, and jobs over ecology and public health.
And in many ways, he succeeded. But the question is, what will the shift in policy over the last 4 years mean for the environment, not just for the United States, but for the planet? Stay with us.
Hi, Trump on Earth listeners. Well, we've done it. We've come to the end of our podcast. After 4 years and 100 episodes, we're finished with Trump on Earth. We'll be launching a new podcast in the coming weeks, which will cover where we go from here. And there's still time to weigh in on what you'd like to hear. Go to trumponearth.org to take our short survey. And please continue to support our efforts at Patreon as we move from Trump on Earth to something new, like Earth to Joe? I don't know. We don't know yet. But we'd love to hear from you at trumponearth.org. And keep the Trump on Earth feed in your podcast app. We'll keep you posted.
So for our last Trump on Earth episode, let's take stock of the past 4 years. What's happened with environmental policy under the Trump administration?
Oh, where to begin, Julie? Where should we begin? How about climate change?
Okay, well, let's hear President Trump's views in his own words.
And I keep hearing about global warming. Now they'll say, he doesn't understand. This is a worldwide problem. Oh, no, I don't understand. Let's do IQ tests.
Well, I'm not a big believer in man-made climate change. There could be some impact, but I don't believe it's a devastating impact.
Mr. President, have you read the climate report yet? I've seen it. I've read some of it, and it's fine.
But they say economic impact could be devastating to climate change.
I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe it. And by the way, it's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming.
I think that there'll be little change here. It'll go up. It'll get a little cooler. It'll get a little warmer like it always has for millions of years. It'll get cooler. It'll get warmer. It's called weather.
I was thinking, what if he said, no, I've seen the hurricane situations. I've changed my mind. There really is climate change. And I thought, wow, what an impact. What an impact that would make.
I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. You know, we're talking about over millions of years. They say that we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael.
Who says that? They say. You mean
well,
the people on the phone?
People say that in the...
Yeah, but what about the scientists who say it's worse than ever?
You'd have to show me the scientists because they have a very big political agenda, Leslie.
I can't bring them in.
Scientists also have a political agenda.
So what did he do on climate? Reed, how about some of his greatest hits?
Well, probably the greatest hit of all is he almost immediately pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords. That's the international agreement that the Obama administration entered us into, putting almost every country on the planet on a path to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. Not only that, but he rolled back several major Obama-era climate regulations. These included limits on carbon pollution from power plants and automobiles and oil and gas operations. Lots of stuff.
Yeah, and he campaigned on bringing coal back. So how did that go?
Not great. Coal has continued its long decline. We're mining the lowest amount of coal here now since the 1970s. And while the number of people who work in coal mines has basically leveled off over the last 4 years, that really took a steep decline with the coronavirus. Coal is now among the most expensive ways to make electricity, more expensive than natural gas and increasingly wind and solar energy. Though Trump did try, there was talk for a while from the administration about a kind of coal bailout, a coal and nuclear bailout, actually, but that was shot down by federal regulators.
So with all the different efforts by the Trump administration, what's been the impact?
Well, I tried to gauge this by speaking to a few experts about this. And the resounding answer has been basically that we've lost a lot of time when it comes to doing something about climate change. Here's how Kara Horowitz put it. She's a climate expert at UCLA's School of Law.
Trump cost the planet 4 years is one way to think about it, of progress on climate and energy. And that's 4 years that we didn't have to lose.
So not only did the U.S. not help, but it actually hurt climate action.
Trump did more than just take the U.S. off the table. He really slowed international progress on climate change, too. Just the way we think of the U.S. as being able to lead on climate in a positive way, it can also be a drag on climate. And we saw that in spades during the Trump administration.
Yeah, so how does the U.S. act as a drag on climate action around the world? Aren't other countries just doing their own thing?
Yeah, so other countries are still in the Paris Climate Agreement, but, you know, without the U.S. kind of pushing countries for more aggressive action on climate change, those other countries are doing less, and that stands to reason. Horowitz points out that the latest round of pledges from other countries on carbon reductions have been a little underwhelming, the ones that have recently come in.
It's fair to say they're weaker than they would be if we had a United States at the table who was really, twisting arms and egging countries on the way that, for example, President Obama did when he was first forging the alliances that made the Paris Agreement possible in the first place.
Okay, well, there are a variety of sources tracking the environmental regulatory rollbacks, Harvard and Columbia law schools, and there are well over 100. But is there a sense of the total impact of the past 4 years of rollbacks on climate change?
Yeah, so there's been a recent analysis that just came out. If they were all to basically reach maturity, these rollbacks would account for about 2 billion tons of CO2 added to the atmosphere over the next 15 years. Now, to put that in perspective, the U.S. produces about 6 billion tons of CO2 a year. So that's like adding 4 more months of CO2 emissions, by the year 2035. Now, that may not seem like that much, but keep in mind this is at a time when we really need to be going in the opposite direction and getting closer and closer to zero emissions as a planet. And just this week, in a surprise move, the EPA finalized a rule that would prohibit future regulations to control carbon emissions from any stationary source outside of big power plants. These include things like oil and gas wells and refineries. Essentially, only the power sector could be regulated for greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. But we don't know if that regulation will hold up in the future.
So could the Trump administration changes be reversed?
Horowitz says she thinks a lot of these rollbacks could be reversed either by the courts or by the Biden administration, or, there is a way for Congress to undo some of these.
Okay, well, let's take a little break and then talk about some of the major environmental changes under Trump.
People said, "What's with the light bulb?" I said, "Here's the story." And I looked at it. The bulb that we're being forced to use, number one, to me, most importantly, the light's no good. I always look orange. And so do you. The light is the worst.
Early on in the Trump administration, it became clear that he wanted to cut regulations. At one point, Trump announced a 2-for-1 rule. For every one new rule the administration created, it would repeal or roll back 2 of them.
No president has ever cut so many regulations in their entire term, okay, as we've cut in less than a year.
Okay, so let's get into what some of these major rollbacks were.
Well, we need to look back at 2015. That's when President Obama created climate regulation called the Clean Power Plan. It was to regulate carbon dioxide from American power plants, the country's biggest source of greenhouse gases.
We're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. And that's why I committed the United States to leading the world on this challenge, because I believe there is such a thing as being too late.
But that plan never really got off the ground. More than a dozen states sued the Environmental Protection Agency over the rule.
And after that, the U.S. Supreme Court put the Clean Power Plan on hold while these lawsuits played out.
Right, and then enter the Trump administration, which early on took aim to repeal it.
My administration is putting an end to the war on coal. Going to have clean coal, really clean coal. With today's executive action, I am taking historic steps to lift the restrictions on American energy, to reverse government intrusion, and to cancel job-killing regulations.
I spoke with Dan Farber. He's director of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at the University of California, Berkeley. He said Trump was required by the courts to come up with a replacement to the Clean Power Plan.
And the replacement regulation is really pathetic.
Farber says the Obama plan would have reduced carbon emissions by about 17%, but the Trump plan cuts much less.
It would cut about 3% of the current carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants, and it doesn't do anything at all for natural gas-fired power plants. So it's really barely qualifies as a token effort.
And now that Trump rule is currently being challenged in the courts.
So each administration's rule got challenged, and we could basically have another go at this with the Biden administration. Do I have that right, Julie?
Yeah, that's right. And the Biden administration would have to start a new rulemaking process, and that can take years.
So another peg of the Obama climate plan was to rein in emissions from cars and trucks. The Obama administration created fuel efficiency goals for cars and trucks that were around 50 miles per gallon. Julie, what can you tell me about this plan?
Yeah, I spoke with Omer Irfan, who covers these issues for Vox. He says automakers didn't like Obama's plan and lobbied the Trump administration.
They wanted to reopen it and try to get a little bit more flexibility in. But instead, the Trump administration gave them a wholesale rollback of these rules, which is not what they wanted either.
So, Reed, I know you talked with an expert in California's EPA about this in an episode of Trump on Earth, who said even though the automakers didn't want such a wholesale rollback of the rules, the oil companies did.
Yeah, so California actually tried to create its own stricter fuel efficiency standards. But then Trump tried to strip the state of its authority to do that and had the Department of Justice even launch an antitrust investigation of any automakers that supported the state.
Yeah, that investigation has since been dropped.
So it's not just regulations on climate change that the administration rolled back. Let's talk about some others.
Yeah, there have been regulations on air and water pollution, chemical safety, methane leaks from oil and gas, coal ash, you name it. There have been all kinds of rollbacks.
I want every cabinet secretary, agency head, and federal worker to push even harder to cut even more regulations in 2018, and that should just about do it. I don't know if we'll have any left to cut, but we'll always find them.
We talked earlier about coal-burning power plants. Of course, they emit more than just carbon. Along with oil-burning plants, they're some of the biggest emitters of mercury in the U.S. Exposure to mercury has been linked to certain neurological disorders, harm to the cardiovascular and immune systems.
The Obama administration created something called the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards in 2011 to limit the emission of mercury and other toxic pollutants.
But in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that EPA regulation must weigh the costs to industry in addition to public health and environmental risks. So when the Trump EPA looked at the costs, it found that the mercury rule was no longer appropriate and necessary.
So this happened even though utility companies had already complied with the standards that Obama put in place basically in 2011. Is that right? And if that's right, why would you reverse a rule that coal-fired power plants are already complying with?
Well, first, Berkeley law professor Dan Farber points out that the mercury rule provided other air quality benefits.
The direct benefit of regulating is the reduction in mercury, but there is this co-benefit, as it's called, which is reducing the particulates.
And by particulates, he means fine particles that are linked to heart and lung disease.
And while the co-benefit of reducing particulate matter is good for public health, the Trump EPA didn't include this in calculating the benefits of the mercury rule.
So is this whole issue really about these co-benefits?
Yeah, Farber says so. He says this is part of a longer-term strategy.
Industry and conservatives have argued for a long time that you should not consider co-benefits. You should ignore those thousands or tens of thousands of people dying when you're regulating. That really kind of ties one of EPA's arms behind its back in terms of being able to address environmental problems.
Okay, so what are some other major rollbacks?
Well, one of the most important environmental laws most people have never heard of is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. It requires agencies to analyze how proposed federal highways or pipelines or other big projects will affect the environment, what's called an environmental impact assessment. And NEPA assures that citizens have a chance to voice their opinions.
So Trump is a real estate developer by trade, and he hated it, right?
Yeah, well, last summer, President Trump unilaterally weakened the law, limiting public review. The administration claimed it would save hundreds of millions of dollars over almost a decade by reducing the amount of time allowed for environmental reviews of major projects.
So we're cutting the federal permitting timeline for a major project from up to 20 years or more, hard to believe, down to 2 years or less.
We spoke with Sharon Buccino in an episode last January. She's Senior Director of the Lands Division of the Natural Resources Defense Council.
What Trump is trying to do and has proposed in these regulations is to say right off the bat, we know best. The agency gets to decide on its own without any kind of public input what NEPA should apply to and what counts as minimal and what counts as major.
But as I understand this, Julie, a Biden administration could flip this back?
Yeah, because this change to NEPA came late in his term. Democrats in Congress could overturn it using something called the Congressional Review Act. It's a tool Congress and a new president can use to overturn rules issued at the end of a previous administration.
Okay, so let's look at one other big rollback that happened early on in Trump's term. The Waters of the U.S. rule.
Earlier today, my administration formally repealed the horrible, dangerous, anti-everything Waters of the United States rule.
A lot of people go by the acronym WOTUS.
I always say the only thing that had going for it that was good was the title. I said, I'm the only one that would sign this.
Julie, explain what WOTUS is and why it's important.
Yeah, well, this was Obama's update to the Clean Water Act. The question of which waterways the federal government has the authority to regulate has been up in the air for a long time, for decades. Obama, he was trying to clarify it, but it was perceived by a lot of people as an overreach.
Government will no longer try to micromanage every rain puddle and every drainage ditch on private land. They took your land away from you.
Some of the major groups opposing this were ranchers and the real estate industry.
And there were numerous lawsuits challenging it. Berkeley's Dan Farber says early on, Trump focused on this.
Trump said during the campaign he was going to get rid of the Obama rule. And so they set upon doing that. And they finally did both repeal the Obama rule first, and then they come along with a substitute rule which protects a lot fewer wetlands in particular and opens them up to commercial development or oil and gas operations with really no federal protection.
Can you give us an idea of how many waterways we're talking about here?
Sure. In an episode of Trump on Earth in late 2018, a reporter for E&E News who had tracked down the numbers told us that under Trump's water rule, more than half the nation's wetlands and nearly a fifth of the streams are no longer protected under the Clean Water Act.
Wow. And so where do things stand now with this rule?
Well, it's been finalized, and of course, it's being challenged in court. The Biden administration would have to go through a new rulemaking process to replace it, and that can take years. In the meantime, there's concern about the impact on water quality and on migratory birds.
In addition to all this, another area of consequential change under the Trump administration was its impact on public lands. The federal government is the nation's largest landowner, managing 500 million acres under the Department of the Interior. We asked our producer, Andy Cubis, to look more closely at what impact the administration has had on this land.
About 1/3 of the United States is federally owned. This land includes national parks, forests, and other protected areas. And that means the president has a lot of power over these places.
With your help in treating our natural bounty with respect, gratitude, and love, we will put our nation's treasures to great and wonderful use.
The Trump administration pursued an aggressive agenda of removing protections for huge swaths of public lands and water, from Alaska to the coastal waters of the eastern seaboard, all in the name of energy development.
We need an American-first energy plan. It's going to be, from now on, America first.
Trump is the only president in U.S. history to have attempted to remove more public lands, nearly 35 million acres, than he protected.
This means opening federal lands for oil and gas production, opening offshore areas, and revoking policies that are imposing unnecessary restrictions on innovative new exploration technologies.
His actions equate to stripping protections from an area the size of North Carolina, according to one analysis.
I mean, there have long been flare-ups and controversies associated to public lands management. I mean, that's the messy part of democracy.
Martin Nye is a professor of natural resources policy at the University of Montana. He was on our podcast in 2017 and said the administration has taken that to new levels.
I've never seen it at this level. I mean, it's multiple fire hoses, or maybe fire hydrants going off at the same time, and I'm pretty stretched right now to keep up with all of it.
Perhaps the most well-known hit to public lands protections happened early on in the Trump administration.
I've heard a lot about Bears Ears, and I hear it's beautiful.
Trump reduced the size of two vast national monuments in Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, by 2 million acres.
The Antiquities Act does not give the federal government unlimited power to lock up millions of acres of land. It's time we ended this abusive practice.
That move did not unleash the fossil fuel bonanza that some expected. In the end, it proved too costly for fossil fuel companies to get to the underground oil, gas, and coal. On top of that, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, a group of 5 indigenous tribes, immediately issued a legal challenge, along with environmental groups. The lawsuits are still making their way through federal court. President-elect Joe Biden has promised to restore the monuments. That executive order is expected to come within Biden's first 100 days. Meanwhile, Trump has spent his waning days in office pushing through a number of other mining and energy projects on federal lands. The Associated Press reported this month that beginning in late 2020, when it looked like Biden's win was certain, companies submitted over 3,000 drilling permits to the Bureau of Land Management. That's the federal agency in charge of regulating oil and gas on public lands. Nearly half of those permits were approved, the highest rate of any period during the Trump administration. The agency was already having trouble keeping up. Back in 2019, we heard from Rachel Levin, a reporter for the Center for Public Integrity. She spent time in New Mexico, one of the hottest drilling spots in North America, and wrote about what happens when drilling overwhelms the agency tasked with protecting America's lands.
One of the most powerful moments for me was when one of the ranchers that I went out with pointed us to this development, and he said, we're supposed to be notified before this kind of development occurs. That never happened. There were tanks, there was a big water pit going in. That really encapsulated to me kind of the chaos of what's going on out there, that there's just so much development and there is a real difficulty in keeping up with even the administrative parts of those tasks of managing it.
All of this amounts to what Trump's energy dominance agenda looks like on the ground. And with the new permits in place, the Biden administration won't be able to do much to keep companies from drilling on these public lands, even with Democrats controlling Congress and the White House. For Trump on Earth, I'm Andy Cubis.
So also in the last few weeks, we should add the Trump administration has weakened some key wildlife laws.
Yeah, in December, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service changed the definition of critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act. The new rule would shrink the amount of land protected for species threatened with extinction, and that would open it up for agriculture, logging, and other development. And this comes after another key change to the Endangered Species Act, one that allows the federal government to consider economic impacts, things like job losses and revenue, when deciding whether to classify a species as endangered or threatened.
And here's another new rule change. Under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the federal government won't penalize companies that accidentally or incidentally kill birds. So, for instance, oil companies won't be liable for killing thousands of birds because of an oil spill.
Yeah, we spoke with Brad Bortner, the former official in charge of the Federal Migratory Bird Program, on the podcast last February. And he says scientific studies show tens of thousands of birds are killed each year by a variety of industries.
You know, there are examples of tall radio towers that kill 1,000 birds a night by collisions. You know, a foggy night, lights disorient them, and the birds all crash into a tower.
Bortner said under the new rule, industry would only be held accountable for bird deaths if it intentionally kills birds. So a company is not liable even if it knows its actions will cause harm. He said the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is no longer investigating bird deaths, so there's really no way to know how many birds are being killed.
In a minute, we'll talk about something that underpins all of these issues we've been talking about, the Trump team's views on science. Stay with us. You're listening to Trump on Earth.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
When Trump took office, one of the open questions about his administration was about its relationship with science. Trump, after all, famously called global warming a hoax.
This doesn't bother me if it didn't mean
Now,
anything.
what do you mean hoax?
Well, it's a hoax. I think the scientists are having a lot of fun. It was, I wouldn't say started, just like Al Gore started the internet. He's the one that really is the big proponent. The problem we're doing is we're making our manufacturing, our factories, and other things, we're making them non-competitive to other countries.
Trump's skepticism and emphasis on deregulation during his campaign and the early days of his administration had many environmentalists and scientists on edge.
Remember the March for Science?
Did we vote to reduce the EPA's research budget by a whopping 42%? Did we vote to defund safe drinking water by 1/3? Well, that's what we got.
That's how upset scientists were. They took to the streets to protest the administration. That month, April 2017, I spoke about this with Gretchen Goldman, research director for the Union of Concerned Scientists.
What we're seeing under Trump is that this is a whole different ballgame. We're seeing plenty of abuses, and they're happening faster in this administration than we've ever seen before.
Goldman said the administration hadn't even passed the 100-day mark yet, and already they were hearing that career scientists at federal agencies felt worried about the futures of their jobs in the administration. There were also concerns about science being reviewed by political appointees and threats to funding.
I think altogether these are serving to have a chilling effect on federal scientists, and they're very anxious about this situation.
The Union of Concerned Scientists says the suppression of science and scientists has cut across federal agencies. Studies critical of industry were getting held up. Scientists were getting blocked from speaking with the media. In August 2019, longtime USDA climate researcher Louis Ziska told us his agency took an already accepted research paper and changed the conclusion.
First thing I thought was, well, this is no longer about the science. This is about somebody's ideology.
He's one in a line of researchers who've left the federal government because of its treatment of science. But nowhere was this conflict more apparent than at the Environmental Protection Agency.
This is really a great day. It's a banner day.
In May of 2018, then EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt announced the proposed Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science rule.
This is not a policy. This is not a memo. This is a proposed rule. And the reason that's important is because this is not just something that we're proposing that may last for 2 months or 2 years. It is a codification of an approach that says as we do our business at the agency, the science that we use is going to be transparent. It's going to be reproducible.
Now, transparency seems like a laudable goal, especially when we're talking about scientific studies. But Julie, what did scientists say about this?
Well, they did not support it, to say the least. Public health research uses a lot of sensitive personal medical information, and many people only participate because it can be kept confidential. They don't want it publicly available. I spoke with Dr. Mary Rice in December of 2019 when it was leaked that the rule was closer to being finalized. She's a physician and one of 5 scientists to testify before the House Science Committee on that proposed rule.
Would you be willing to enroll yourself or your child in a study about toxins in the water, air, or food if you knew EPA would take your data and share it with the world?
The rule limits the studies that EPA uses to make regulatory decisions to those where the raw data is public. So under the rule, when EPA is looking to regulate industries to protect public health, it would give less consideration to studies that don't provide open access to the personal information of its subjects. Here's Dr. Rice again.
As a doctor, I would do my patients a disservice if I ignored a huge chunk of the scientific literature in making my medical decisions. And the same would be true for EPA if it ignored evidence in making decisions about toxins in our environment.
And Rice says the rule was particularly scary to her because it doesn't just impact one policy, but pretty much anything the EPA has to decide on.
I'm very concerned that the implications of such a change for our health and the next generation could be extensive and even irreversible.
Just this month, the EPA announced it finalized this transparency rule. But according to recent reports, this could be a rule Biden and the Democrats in Congress reverse through the Congressional Review Act.
Okay, let's look at another major shift at EPA that shows the Trump administration's view of science and federal scientists, the reorganization of the agency's science advisory boards. So, Reed, what are these boards?
Yeah, so these are panels of independent scientists that hired by the agency to review, science around kind of controversial EPA regulations. So they've done these on fracking and air pollution and lots of other topics of public concern. We spoke with the guy who was in charge of these boards for a few years into the Trump administration. His name was Chris Zarba. And in 2017, Zarba was told that he could no longer have anybody on these boards if they received grants from the EPA.
So I literally had to pick up the phone and fire 30 plus scientists.
But scientists who received grants from the industry were exempted. They could still serve on these boards.
Right. So what's been the impact of these changes?
With all of these changes put in place, the EPA has issued new standards for ozone and particulate pollution that were actually weaker than what the scientists originally on those boards had recommended.
Yeah, and Zarba said it wasn't always like this at EPA, that there wasn't all that much difference between Republican and Democratic administrations when it came to how science was treated at the agency. But he said all that changed over the last 4 years.
There's been a huge exodus in talent from the agency. Many of its efforts have been slowed down. So future efforts to protect human health and the environment have been stalled or slowed down or ended.
And it remains to be seen whether some of these changes can be reversed by the Biden administration or how long we'll be living with Trump's science policies. All we know now is that Trump appears to be leaving the White House.
Reed, what do you take away from some of these changes and how the environment has been treated by the federal government?
Yeah, so one of the things we have are these lasting images from the last 4 years. Kara Horowitz, the legal expert from UCLA, said her lasting image is from when Trump came to California in the fall of 2020 during the height of wildfire season and said basically that he didn't think climate change was causing these fires.
If we ignore that science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay. It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually. Tom, please.
Mr. President. Scientists are clear that these fires are made worse by climate change.
I actually don't think I'll ever forget the gall of a president to come and talk to our leaders ostensibly in a supportive role in this time of real need and mock us, mock our scientists, mock our state leaders, mock our efforts to do something about this problem by getting a hold of climate change.
There's also just this one comment that stuck with me from Costas Samaras. He's an engineer at Carnegie Mellon University who studies climate. And he said the one thing he'll remember during this whole time is not really, just what Trump has said or done on the environment, but this huge response from the climate movement.
There's always reason for hope in climate change. And so I think that the most important thing is to remember is there's always going to be something worth saving. And there's always going to be something worth fighting for in getting to a climate-safe future.
So those are some of the things that I think I take away.
I feel like I learned a lot about how the government works just by hearing the changes that were happening.
I totally agree with you in that these last 4 years have really woken me up to how the government functions or is supposed to function or doesn't really function in a lot of cases. When a lot of these big landmark regulations are sort of pulled back, you sort of have to sit up and say, wait, what now? What's happening? So I feel like the last 4 years has been, and I know I'm not alone here, has been a sort of big what now moment.
That's our last podcast of Trump on Earth, episode 101.
Stay tuned for a new podcast in the coming weeks. There's still time to fill our survey out on what you'd like to hear about climate Biden regulations. Let us know. It's at our website, trumponearth.org.
You can go back and re-listen and relive the Trump years if you'd like. Thank you so much for listening.
This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. A special shout out to all of our guests, all 100 or whatever of you, all of the listeners and the patrons over the last 4 years. We really appreciated it and liked getting to know you.
Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. Kara Holsopple helped produce this episode and many others. I'm Julie Grant.
And I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks so much for listening.